Welcome to the number one podcast covering Michigan State basketball. The Final Four is not on the schedule. Join Rod and me, Eric, as we dive deep into the Spartans to get you prepared for every game. Subscribe today for in-depth recruiting updates and fantastic interviews with today's important college basketball personalities like Robbie Hummel.
Thanks for having me. I have listened to your guys' podcast numerous times on drives throughout any Midwestern Big Ten city. So I am big fans of your guys' work.
Jay Billis.
And next time, hey, if anybody in Michigan wants a December tea time, call me. You wimps won't show up, but I'll be there. I'll be there and play in the cold. And Izzo will be in front of the fire with hot chocolate.
Coaches Thomas Kelly.
No problem. Glad to be back, man. Glad to be back.
Mike Garland.
Just can't sit there and trade twos for threes. You can't do it. You're gonna lose. Coming down the stretch, you're gonna lose.
And more. You won't find better coverage of Spartan hoops than you will get here. For both the casual and hardcore fan, come along as we take you for a green and white ride. Hey folks, breaking into the show because we record these shows quite a bit in advance for these previews, and turns out, right as the show's about to drop, Gabe from Nudge Printing has a huge sale that he's having at Nudge Printing, and we want to tell you about that so you don't miss it, and you're able to take advantage of it. Right now, with the start of the football season, he has $19.99 for tees, $39.99 crew neck sweatshirts to celebrate the start of the football season. The sale ends Monday, so you want to take advantage of this before Labor Day. So head on over to Nudge Printing at nudgeprinting.com. Remember, you get 20% off if you mention Final Four. Just that's one word, typing it as a coupon code at checkout. And so it's a great opportunity to get some great Spartan apparel. And again, it's a favor of my family. You won't regret it. All right, now on to the show. Hey everybody, it's Eric alongside Rod here, moving along to our next stop in the Big Ten previews, number 17, the Washington Huskies. The Pacific Northwest is now Big Ten country, but it's probably safe to say it isn't college basketball country. Despite all the talent that comes out of Seattle, not a lot of it has recently ended up at the U. A reminder that each year, Rod will offer his prognostication for the final standings of the Big Ten, teams 1 through 18. This also means that you can also enter to beat our Beat Rod challenge and see if you are the best at predicting and better than Rod. The winner gets $100 in free apparel from our great Spartan sponsor, Nudge Printing. So send along your entries to Eric, E-R-I-C, at TIFFNOTS, TFFINOTS.com. So that's rankings 1 through 18, the final Big Ten standings. The tiebreaker will be how many points Michigan State scores against Michigan this year. And just a reminder, they play twice. All right, so last season, in the final year of Pac-12, although now it's the Pac-2, the Huskies saw the end of the Mike Hopkins era, one that ended kind of in a fizzle. He was a longtime Syracuse assistant, but didn't really see a lot of big breakthroughs consistently in Washington. They ended their season 17-15 overall, 9-11 in the league, which was, I think, only 12 games over 500 in his overall record in 7 seasons at Washington, which was obviously not enough to keep his job. And Washington decided to head a different direction. And so they brought in the coach with probably the best name in the Big Ten, Danny Sprinkle, who's been a head coach for only 5 years, 4 of them at Montana State, spent a year at Utah State, made the NCAA tournament, and now finds himself in the big times, Big Ten, and is going to try and establish a winning program in Seattle. And then, like most coaches entering the Big Ten, it's kind of hard to know how ultimately the team will look and sort of how they play. But at least previously, a lot of man defense, a lot of trapping zone, and tends to play pretty fast tempo offense.
Well, he says he wants to. He talks about it, but I looked at it. None of the 5 teams he's been the head coach for was inside the top 100 in average length of offensive possession. So I don't know what that means.
Yeah.
Mostly a man guy. He'll occasionally employ 1-3-1 trapping zone to kind of try and speed the opposition up. Also not big on shooting 3-point shots in terms of attempts. So when I take all of that into account, I actually think I have more confidence in his style making sense in the Big Ten than other guys who come in talking about playing fast and, we're going to press and all the other nonsense that gets thrown out the window once they actually get a look at the caliber of guard play and scouting in this league. So I think that, he seems to rely on sound, solid mostly half court play without excessive risk taking at either end. And that can be a recipe for success in this league. Now, it depends on a lot of other things, and we'll see how that goes over time. Going back to Mike Hopkins first, there was a lot of enthusiasm, I think, when they brought Hopkins in, because he had long been seen as the head coach in waiting at Syracuse, but Jim Boeheim just didn't seem to want to retire. So when a high major job, and potentially an interesting one, at Washington came open, Hopkins took it, and it never quite worked out. You mentioned he ended his career over 7 years, only 12 games over 500.
And that's overall.
Overall.
Yeah. That's
not in the league.
Yeah.
That's just not going to get it done, even at a place that really doesn't care overly about basketball, which is how I would characterize Washington. We had a guest on earlier this summer who covers Washington, and that he basically confirmed what had always been my impression of Washington, and basketball, which is that it's a nice pastime while you're thinking about spring football.
Right.
And that's kind of where it sits, which is not a total outlier in this league. I mean, I think the Big Ten is, along with the ACC, probably one of the two conferences that cares most deeply about basketball across the board. People could argue that, but that's what I think. But within the league, there certainly are other places, Ohio State, Michigan, where I think it's fair to make that, Penn State for sure, yeah, where I think it's fair to make that same kind of assessment. So it doesn't mean Washington's a complete outlier. It just means they're not on the they're not at the level that some other schools in the league are in terms of how much the culture of the university sporting following really cares about the sport. And so when that happens, you can have a coach who's not having great success last longer than he would in other places,
right,
like Bloomington or West Lafayette. But even for guys like that, eventually the end comes, and that's what happened with Hopkins. So then cutting back to Sprinkle for a second, we talked about his style, but I want to talk about his results. He's been a head coach for 5 years, the first 4 at Montana State, and then a quick 1-year stop at Utah State before getting this job. He's made the tournament in each of his last 3 seasons.
Yeah,
so that's
impressive.
2 bids at Montana State, 1 at Utah State. Particularly at Montana State, that's impressive because that's a 1-bid league.
Right.
So anytime you can do it multiple times in a 1-bid league, it doesn't guarantee that you're going to have success when you move up the ladder. But boy, it's a better indicator than anything else. So I think that, his hiring is not a high-profile one. It certainly doesn't match the hype that some of the other new coaches in the league, notably Dusty May of Michigan and Eric Musselman at USC are much more high-profile names. But I don't think there's any guarantee that he doesn't end up being a better hire than either of those guys.
Right.
We'll see. I'm not saying I'd bet on that, but he's had success at places where it's not easy to have success. And he's still fairly young in his career too. So if I were a Washington fan, I would be enthusiastic about what the possibilities may be. And you just have to let it play out. Not a no-brainer hire, but makes sense in a lot of ways. He's from that part of I think he's a UW alum, but he's from that part of the country regardless. He's been a head coach in that part of the country, so he knows the territory up there. And as you mentioned at the outset, ton of talent produced in Seattle in particular. Washington has not done a great job at securing that talent. Now, we know that high school recruiting is less important than it's ever been, but it can still help if you get those guys.
Yeah.
And so that'll be interesting to see how Sprinkle does in that regard, in addition to how well he works the portal. But like I say, I think I'd be enthusiastic if I cared about Washington basketball.
Yeah, I think when we had our guest on, we talked about in comparison to Minnesota basketball in some respects. I mean, the difference, of course,
absolutely.
is Minnesota is, from a football standpoint, it's not what Washington ever was. And so it's, I guess you could say it's more 50-50 school or something like that. But at least with the difficulty in attracting talent from a very large metropolitan area, they're in Minneapolis. They can't get the Minneapolis players. Washington's in Seattle. They can't get the Seattle players oftentimes, and they get sort of
it's a great comparison. It's a great comparison. It really is.
And maybe they're the same, the same situation. Can you maintain that? Will he have the Ben Johnson problem where you get players and then lose them? We just talked about Minnesota last
totally
episode.
Fair. Yep.
We'll see.
I agree. They're good. They're good comparison points.
All right, so let's go on and we'll talk about the players departing the program. Brought to you by the Squeegee Squad of Grand Rapids. If you need to clean your house, clean your windows, or clean out your program, there's no better place than the Squeegee Squad of Grand Rapids. They have a very large region, even if you're in the Grand Rapids adjacent. So anywhere in the West Michigan area, really, they can take care of you. They even clean the windows of the Capitol, and we all know how dirty Lansing can get. So check out the Squeegee Squad of Grand Rapids, 15% off if you mention Final Four to get a discount on your estimate. You can find that at the support page at the Final Fours on the schedule.com/support, or if you're lazy, tffinots.com/support. All right, the first player we'll talk about is Keon Brooks, former player from Kentucky, a forward and Michigan State recruit. He had a good senior season. He averaged 21.1 points a game, 6.8 rebounds a game, and shot 49, 38, and 79.
Yeah, nice end to his career. It just never really worked at Kentucky. And Keon Brooks is a guy Michigan State really went at hard. He's from Indiana. He's a guy they wanted very badly, and he ended up going to Kentucky, and it just never quite came together for him there. But he did have a nice run at the end of his career once he transferred to Washington. I think he was there for 2 years. And you can't argue with his numbers. Now, it didn't lead to a ton of winning, but statistically, Keon Brooks had a nice end to his career.
And then his teammate is Severe Wheeler, 6-foot point guard, also transferred from Kentucky. He averaged 14.3 points a game, had a real problem shooting the three, and only shot 26% last year from three, averaged 6.1 assists per game to 3.3 turnovers per game, so less than 2-to-1 assist-to-turnover ratio.
Yeah, I don't quite know what happened with Severe Wheeler because, he transferred into Kentucky from Georgia, I believe is where he started. And a couple of years prior, he was really good to the point that heading into not last season, but the season prior, his final year at Kentucky, I thought he might be as good a pure point guard as there was in America. You remember Michigan State beat that Kentucky team early in the year, two seasons ago. It was that game that one of the two huge Madi Sissoko games. Malik Hall made that great play at the end to take it into OT, or double OT. But and that was the year where it kind of fell off the rails with Wheeler, and he transferred to Washington, and I don't think it firmly got back on the beam there either. I mean, 14 points a game is nice, but 3.3 turnovers a game is way high. This is a guy that was among the best playmakers in America previously, earlier in his career, and he couldn't even get to a 2-to-1 ratio. Assist-to-turnover ratio at Washington last season. And as you mentioned, the major weakness for him offensively was shooting the three. He was always able to get to the basket and get some point production around the rim, but I'm not saying you can't be an effective point guard if you can't shoot the jumper, because you clearly can, but it's harder.
Yeah.
And it was always an issue for him.
Yeah, you can't be one-dimensional.
Never got solved.
Next would be Corin Johnson, 6'2", sophomore guard. He averaged 11.1 points a game, hit 37% of his threes. He ended up transferring to Louisville.
Yeah, I mean, a nice freshman season. The numbers look good at least, but, I think it was inevitable, and it's just kind of the way it goes. When you have a coaching change, now more than ever, because guys have instant eligibility and total free agency, you're going to see situations like this where guys that an incoming head coach would want to keep around to see how it works with them, are far more often opting to start over somewhere else.
Yeah.
And so that's what happened with Johnson.
Another senior graduated, Moses Wood, 6'8", forward, averaged 11.9 points a game, 4.5 rebounds a game, shot 42, 40, and 87.
Yeah, those are, it's
good numbers.
It's funny. Look at some of these numbers offensively, and it's not easy to understand why this team was only, 17 and 15 and 9-11 in the league. This would put up decent numbers for a power forward.
And then Paul Mulcahy, 6'6" guard, transferred from Rutgers, which was a surprise, we thought, for his COVID year. Only averaged 5.5 points a game, 3.4 assists a game, shot 44, 31, 77. I think we talked, he was injured part of the season as well. So just a very disappointing way to end his college career, and, in a sort of puzzling move from Rutgers to Washington.
I'll bring this point up several times as we move through these previews, but there are a lot of individual cases that I find illustrative of how strange college basketball has gotten in this era, and Paul Mulcahy would be one of them. So he has 4 years at Rutgers, by all accounts, most of all his own. Really enjoyed his time at Rutgers. He's a New Jersey guy, seemed to be very much a symbiotic fit with his head coach, Steve Peichel. Critically important player in the rise of Rutgers into a consistent, if not an NCAA tournament team every year, at least a team that you couldn't dismiss.
Right.
Which is light years beyond where they've been for decades, And then he transfers. And it's one thing if you say, well, okay, he's going to go play a year at Duke or Kansas. He wanted to have that experience playing at a powerhouse. All right. Sometimes that happens. Northwestern lost, what was the kid's name? The big kid,
Lance.
Ryan.
Ryan Young.
No,
Pete Nance.
Ryan Young. He goes to Duke.
Yeah.
Pete Nance goes to North Carolina. Right. You understand that, This guy goes to Washington. So he goes all the way across literally the other side of the continent, and not to UCLA, but to a school we've just been talking about that probably doesn't care about basketball any more than Rutgers does, arguably less. Now, the understanding I have is that Mulcahy got paid. It was a good NIL deal. And I know Rutgers has had issues, supposedly, on that front. But what I don't understand, and this gets to the weirdness of the state of the sport right now, is I understand Washington, and we'll talk about a guy they ponied up for in this year's incoming portal class. So they've been able to do it on occasion, but just the idea of Washington really outbidding any other high major for a basketball player just seems very strange to me.
Yeah.
I'm not saying it didn't happen. I believe it happened. I just don't understand why. And I am a big Paul Mulcahy fan. I actually think was a really good player, but I don't understand why you target him. You were also bringing in Severe Wheeler. Paul Mulcahy is a point guard. I know he's 6'6", but he's a point guard. So why did they bring two guys in who are ball-dominant players? It made none of it made any sense. And yeah, he had the injury problems and everything else, but you look at the numbers, and I think you can pretty confidently say it was the worst season of his career. I had also, for the record, heard through the grapevine, and it wasn't rock-solid information, but it makes sense to me intuitively, that Mulcahy almost immediately had buyer's remorse when he got out there and realized, oops, maybe I shouldn't have done this. And I think the way the season went reflected that.
Well, we talk about how, with Michigan State, with far as getting transfers, they're generally people generally people they've recruited and they have a good relationship with. And, like Joey Hauser's a good example. Tyson Walker's an exception.
They had prior existing knowledge,
right?
Yeah,
and so,
absolutely.
but that's a two-way street too. So that's the player understanding what the program was, and so in this market for the transfer, it's generally like a couple of Zoom calls, maybe you do a visit for once. You don't establish a relationship or have a good feel for what program facilities are, et cetera. And it's easy to get out there and like after a couple weeks you're like, oh, this is not what I thought it was going to be. I mean, I could just imagine that happening pretty easily, just like it is for
absolutely
coaches.
Absolutely. Now you get the counter to that is when you've been in college basketball for a while. So in his case, 4 years. You're in a better position than you are as a 17-year-old
sure.
to actually know what you should be looking for. I'll buy that. But even having said that, I don't think it outweighs what you just mentioned. These recruitments tend to be accelerated, to say the least. And how well can you rate? It's one thing if, as you say, you're looking at a school that you were recruited by in high school. You know these people already to some extent. That I understand. But when you're starting, and I don't remember, Mike Hopkins, given his East Coast background, may have recruited Mulcahy out of high school. I'm not sure.
Right.
There's a chance of, on the surface, I could see where there might be some connection. But, man, it's a crapshoot for so many of these guys.
Well, moving on, we'll talk about Nate Calmese, a 6'2" guard, averaged 4.1 points a game. He only played 16 games. He then transferred next door to Washington State, out of the Pac-12 into the Pac-2.
Yeah, interesting that you got, and you see this occasionally in some of these places. And I know we've seen some football transfers between Michigan and Michigan State, both directions, that seem weird, but it just always seems strange. In this case, I don't mean to knock Washington State, but you would characterize it as a step down now.
Well, for sure now, without moving out of a power conference.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
Yeah. So then is Braxton Mia, 7'1", 250-pound senior, averaged 5.3 points a game, 5.3 rebounds a game, started 16 times at UW. He ended up transferring to Nebraska with Fred Hoiberg.
Yeah, and we'll come back to him when it's time to talk about Nebraska, but an important addition for Nebraska because if you remember their big kid last season, Mast, who was so effective, he's out for the year. He's going to miss this coming season due to injury. So they really needed some help on the interior, and Mia is part of that.
And finally, Anthony Holland, 6'5", senior, averaging 2.6 points a game, played 31 games in reserve role for the team.
Yeah, there's not much more to say than that. Backup wing, gave him a little bit of production, but he's out of eligibility.
So the players returning brought to you by Nudge Printing, where you can get your great Spartan apparel if you need stuff for tailgating, just for the summer, getting ready for winter. They've got hoodies, pullovers, pretty much anything you need. Both Spartan apparel, also other schools. Super high quality, very comfortable, and I would say the probably best selection of different kind of logos and that you can find, whether you want vintage
for
Spartan
sure.
stuff or like current Spartan stuff. I mean, it's a great selection, good pricing, free shipping any orders over $55, and you get 20% off if you type in Final Four just as one word into the checkout. Nudgeprinting.com. You can find also links at our support page. So check it out. They provide the prizes for our show and just great Spartans, and so can't go wrong with Nudge Printing. So aren't too many players returning. We'll start with Frank Kepnang, a 6'11", 230-pound senior, averaged 8.3 points a game, 5.9 rebounds a game, along with 1.7 blocks. He only played 10 games, but averaged 14-8 in the final 3 contests before he gets hit by injuries.
Yeah, and they're very optimistic on him. The production in those last 3 games, 14-8, and giving them a rim protection element too. That's important. So, always a nice option to have. You've got a proven big with some years of experience under his belt and some track record of production. That's really helpful. So, I would say keeping Kepnang healthy and producing in the middle is going to be important for this team.
Next, one of my favorite player names is Wilhelm Breidenbach, 6'10" junior. He used to play at Nebraska. He averaged 5.3 points a game, 3.4 rebounds a game in about 16 minutes, shot 57, 33, and 70 and has those great sports goggles.
Yeah. He's a decent, solid player. He was not bad as a freshman. If I remember correctly, I think he was hurt his true freshman season. And then he played 1 year at Nebraska. Was productive enough to indicate there's some potential. Then he opted to transfer to Washington. You mentioned the numbers from last year, not bad. And I think that the way they have to look at him is he's a solid rotation guy, a backup at the interior positions. I would say more power forward than center.
Yeah.
He's not quite enough of a bruiser, but certainly big enough that if you needed him to play some spot minutes at the 5, you could get away with it. But not bad certainly to have a guy like that as a backup.
Yeah, I seem to remember him being sort of a chucker when they played at East Lansing.
Shot selection was an issue, but then that's also
freshman
kind
thing.
of Nebraska's thing.
Well, yeah.
Well,
right.
Nebraska's thing too.
Yeah, right.
So,
So finally, Christian King, 6'8", redshirt freshman, forward. He didn't play last year, he's a big-time three-point shooter in high school. So I guess we'll find out what he turns out to be.
Yeah, and that's really it. I mean, didn't get a chance to play last season. The nice thing, I guess, for anybody in his situation is after that, or potentially the nice thing is that you got a clean slate. We don't know what the previous staff's plans were for him, but he's in a situation where there's very little else coming back, and so you would think there's an opportunity. But guys in this position also, it tends to be make or break because they weren't brought in by the current staff. So you got your 1 year audition, and if it doesn't work, you're probably hitting the road.
Yeah. Well, obviously, since there are only 3 players returning, that means there are a whole lot of newcomers, and so we'll go over those in just a moment here. This is a team not only with a great coach's name, Sprinkle, and they got Breidenbach, but this next newcomer, great Osobor. It's one of the big names they got in the portal, and he had been coached at Utah State, and he was at Montana State before that, so obviously had a relationship with Sprinkle. He's 6'8", 250 pounds, averaged 17.7 points a game, 9 rebounds a game, and 1.4 blocks a game, and shooting 58, 21, and 64.
Yeah, he was, I would say it's fair to characterize. I mean, different rankings, you'll see different evaluations, but Osobor was considered probably one of the 5 or 10 best guys in the portal nationally. Mm-hmm. He could have gone anywhere he wanted, and he had high majors after him. But as you said, he's now at his 3rd different stop with Sprinkle. Started at Montana State, was really good there. Followed him to Utah State, was great at Utah State. And now he's going to be a cornerstone of his first team at Washington. I go back to what I was talking about a few minutes ago about Mulcahy. Washington supposedly had to pony up a lot of money. Osobor is one of those guys that, at least reportedly, it's a 7-figure deal to bring him in. And so it's just weird to me because we know Washington is not a school where basketball is emphasized. And that usually manifests in NIL issues as well. But they've got enough to occasionally bring in guys like this and pay them what they need to, which is good if you're the head coach. I mean, if you're Danny Sprinkle, you're encouraged by that they could do that. But it's hard to understand. And you also have to think, and this is where somebody like Tom Izzo would never do what was just done at Washington. I mean, I'm telling you flat out, I don't think you'd ever see it. So Osobor is making supposedly 7 figures. What about the rest of these guys?
Right.
And what does that do to your locker room? I'm not saying there'll be a problem. That's Danny Sprinkle's issue, and he may handle it just fine. You would assume is perfectly okay with it. But I know that there's no word out there that, Washington's throwing the bags around left, right, and center. They did it with this guy to secure this guy. Well, what does that do? Michigan State, to bring it around to a subject that's near and dear to all of our hearts, my understanding is Michigan State is very competitive with returning guys, which is where the bulk of the NIL goes. So like last year, Tyson Walker, Malik Hall, they got paid basically the going rate to retain a guy of their talent level, their impact, their experience. But it's not this wild chasm between them and everybody else on the roster.
Right.
You know? And so that's another, and what makes it doubly fascinating is we're all, myself included, just working based primarily on hearsay.
Right.
Because none of this stuff is public record.
Yeah.
So I can tell you that I've heard that he's getting 7 figures, and that I've heard that there's no indication that they're paying anywhere close to that kind of money for the rest of their roster. But it's conjecture. I have to admit that. So you never even know for sure. It's why when you see some of these situations where chemistry is obviously an issue, and a good example that most of us will be familiar with is not last season, but the season before at Illinois, where you could just tell by watching that team, something's not right. These guys don't all love playing with each other. Was it that? I don't know. I think so. Maybe. But who knows for sure?
Yeah, well, and through our discussions this summer, and I think even last year, I think we both think that at some point we're moving to contracts, and we're going to move to direct pay from the university to these players.
Yep.
And almost all these universities are public, which means all the contracts will be public, and so there'll be public knowledge, and
Correct.
so there will be less. There will always, I guess, still be the nebulous. There's a deal with Adidas or Nike or something which may or may not be made public, but for the most part, you're going to have a pretty good sense for what the players are getting paid.
Yeah.
And so I think we'll have a better idea of that.
And the players will have a good sense of what the market is.
Exactly.
That's the other thing too, which never gets talked about. Do I believe that there's a reasonably good awareness of what the particulars are of the market? Yeah, because there are agents involved in this stuff. It's their business to know. And so it's not like everybody's completely flying blind, but there's less transparency than there would be. Just real quick, moving back to Osobor as a player, big get for Washington, no two ways about it. I think he'll play the power forward spot, but at 6'8", 250, that's a big power forward. Not a floor stretcher. So if you're going to play, say, he and Kepnang together, as I think they very well may, you may have some issues with spacing. But then again, as I said at the outset, Sprinkle's not a guy that historically has relied a ton on 3 shooting.
Right.
As a big part of his offense. So that may work for him. The free throw shooting is the one thing I think you're looking for some improvement on, because he averaged better than 8 attempts per game. So he gets there a lot. 64% is not a disaster, but you'd like to see that north of 70%. And I think the bottom line is I expect Osobor to be one of the better interior players in the conference. So from a basketball perspective, purely, very important addition. It gives them a focal point in Sprinkle's first season, a guy who, like we talked about with Minnesota, Dawson Garcia, they've got a guy who on a given night, Osobor could carry this team to a win. He's that good.
Yeah. Well, it's funny. We go from a guy named Great to the next player named Zoom. So it's Zoom Diallo. He's a recruit from Washington. They got he's a 6'4" point guard. So I assume he's fast and is supposed to be dynamic. He's not a great jump shooter, but of course he's young.
Yeah, big recruit. And that's the thing, even in previous eras of Washington basketball. So Lorenzo Romar, we talked about that era with our guests some. And then even on occasion with Mike Hopkins, remember they beat Michigan State out for Isaiah Stewart with a pre-NIL bag. But they would occasionally get high-profile talent. So Diallo's not a total outlier in that regard, but definitely a guy that was a heavy-duty recruit nationally. Great size, and I think for the position, and I think the question's going to be how big is his role right off the bat? Because they've brought some guys in that they think can handle that spot. The next guy we'll talk about, as a matter of fact. So this is going to be a classic case of, does experience with a portal guy outweigh big time potential for a true freshman? And keeping all the players happy in that dynamic will be interesting as well. Diallo, as you mentioned, the word is needs to work on his jumper, which is not unheard of for a young point guard, but he's going to play. He's got to play a lot. The only question is whether he starts.
Then moving on to Tyree Ihanacho, a transfer from North Dakota, 6'4" guard, averaging 14.5 points a game on 40, 29, and 64 shooting, along with a marginal assist turnover ratio of 3.9 to 2.2.
Yeah, and again, it'll be interesting to see how this dynamic works because he's another big point guard. Scoring numbers are good. You don't love the jump shooting, 29% from three. The playmaking numbers don't suggest great poise at the position, but he's got starting experience. And so how does that play in? And then how ready is Diallo as a true freshman? Even highly recruited guys, we know, it's not always an automatic that they're ready to, have the keys handed to them. So at the very least, Ihanacho gives Sprinkle another option and a veteran option at a very important position.
Then we go to DJ Davis, 6'1" transfer from Butler. People may remember him from last season when Michigan State played. He averaged 13.5 points a game on 43, 35, and 95 shooting, although he did not do well against Michigan State. He was only 1 for 6 from 3.
Yeah, but a nice addition for them, undersized off guard. He's not a point guard. But those numbers at Butler are okay. 35% from 3, 43% overall, 95 at the line. You'd hope he can get there a lot. I'm not sure that's a big part of his game, but when he does get there, he's automatic. But that's a nice addition. This is a guy who's done it at the Big East level. So he's proven at a high level of basketball. Nothing's going to faze him at Washington in terms of what he sees. I would expect he'll be firmly in the mix to start on the wing. And again, nice element to have. A guy with experience could give you some shooting, and he's done it.
Then we get to Mickey Mason, 6'5", wing transfer from Rice, averaging 14 points a game on 39, 34, and 68 shooting, along with also 4 rebounds a game.
Yeah, with Mason, they got a little more size on the wing. I would expect him to be in the mix for a significant role as well, maybe even starting. Because the nice thing about having Davis as a starter is that both of the guys you talk about the point are 6'4", so they can probably get away with it, provided the other wing is of a little bigger size. They shouldn't have a size issue defensively, but that's what would give Mason a shot.
Next is 6'3" transfer from Rhode Island, Luis Coatwright. He's averaged 10 points a game and 4 rebounds a game with Rhode Island. He shot 44, 30, and 67.
Yeah, I would think he's in line to probably be a reserve, but a guy who's in the rotation. Again, the deep shooting numbers, not great, but, the potential maybe to be better. And experience playing at a school like Rhode Island means he should be able to step in and give them some help.
Then we have Tyler Harris, another contender for a starting role in the perimeter group. He's 6'8", transferred from Portland nearby. Averaged 12.1 points a game and 7.3 rebounds a game. Shot 46, 36, and 68.
Yeah, the numbers are really interesting here, as is the versatility, because they think he can play at the 3 and the 4.
Mm-hmm.
They're great numbers. The question here is, this is not, again, you go back to somebody like DJ Davis or even Cartwright coming from the Atlantic 10. That's different than coming from Portland.
Yeah.
Whereas if you're a West Coast Conference school that's not named Gonzaga or St. Mary's, it's a different level.
Yeah.
And so you don't know how readily that will translate. But man, the kind of versatility that Harris has, he can shoot, he can rebound, he's got good size of 6'8". I think he can play on the perimeter, can also play inside. That's interesting. So it'll be interesting to see where he fits in their rotation and how well he does.
Then we have another player that Michigan State faced last year, 6'10" transfer from Oakland, Chris Conway. He averaged 10 points a game and 4-point rebounds per game, shooting 54, 21, and 76 under Greg Campy.
This is one that I don't understand. Other than just if you just really want to have that year of high major basketball, this was the opportunity that came your way, which maybe that's the case for Conway. But he was a starter, had a significant role on a team that went to the tournament, won a game when they got there, a game that program's going to live on for decades, beating Kentucky. And then you transfer to Washington, where you're probably looking at being the third string center.
Yeah.
I don't understand it, but, to each their own. And I don't believe Conway's from there. He's not from the Northwest, so it's not that. I just don't understand it. Because we're going to talk about another guy in a second who's transferring in, more proven at the high major level, and then, of course, they return Kepnang. Plus, they got guys like Greenbach who could play or Osobor who could play the center as well. I just don't get it, but whatever. It's great for Washington because they have a guy who's produced at the mid-major level and is a veteran as a deep backup. It's a better option than saying some high school kid you just brought in. You have no idea whether he'll even be able to succeed at all at the high major level. With Conway, you got a pretty good idea of what the floor is, at least.
Yeah. Well, and I think probably at some level these players believe in themselves and they think, well, I'm going to move up. I want to move up play at the next level.
Absolutely.
Could be an injury. I mean, I can beat out these guys. I imagine that's part of the thinking as well.
It's easy for me to look at it and say why. And that doesn't take into account what you just said.
Yeah.
That there's a belief within the player that, oh no, I'm going to beat these guys out. I can do it. And maybe Conway will. I just don't love his odds.
Next will be Casey Ibekwe, 6'10", 290-pound transfer. Speaking of 6'10" players, he came from the Beavers at Oregon State. He averaged 5.1 points a game and 4 rebounds a game in 19 minutes. Started 22 times as a sophomore. Shot 52% from the floor, measly 44% from the line. And he's that transfer, I guess, was in a major conference. Now it's not, so he transferred back to a major conference, I guess is one way to look at it.
Yeah, but that production all takes place at the high major level.
Right, yeah, exactly.
So
but he has to stay in the high major. Yeah.
Right. And that's why I'm saying, though, with Conway, like, why?
Yeah.
Because this guy's coming in, they're bringing another guy back. Oh, and they've got power forwards that can play there if they had to. I don't see it because I have to believe Ibekwe stands a better chance of those backup minutes than Conway does because he's done it at a higher level. He's big. I mean, 6'10", 290, that's a big guy. But yeah, again, nice step at the 5 spot for Washington.
And finally, Jace Butler, 6'4" point guard. Originally was going to Illinois, which I feel like we say that a lot.
Yeah.
He ended up going to UW after the hire by Sprinkle.
Yeah, and they also think he shoots well enough that down the line he could maybe be a true combo play off the ball as well as on. I just think with the roster composition this year, it seems less likely that he'll play a lot immediately, but it remains to be seen. They like his potential. Illinois liked him. They were high on him.
And so the Brothers Who Adjust Your Gutters will take care of your gutter work. They'll, whether it's residential, commercial, repair, replace, clean them out, put those leaf guards on so you don't have to get on the ladder all the time. Whatever you need done, they can come do it. 10% off. You mentioned Final Four when you go get their estimate. They're working on the east side of the state, the west side of the state, pretty much in the lower part of Michigan. They'll take care of you. They do fantastic work. Good pricing, too, as well. I had them work on my house, And now my door that I had to restain every year because I thought it was the sun, turns out it was just the rain. I got gutters, and suddenly I don't have to restain my door every time, which, let me tell you, restaining a door in July every year really sucks. So I really appreciate the brothers that put those gutters on. Who knew a little section of gutter would make a big difference? They sponsor the player that teams will have to keep in the gutter, and I suspect you're going to say it's probably Great Osobor. Would you agree?
Yeah, that would be the guy I would bet on as being their headline player. Yeah, for sure.
All right, so overall, this is it's interesting because this is a obviously long established program in some respects, yet it's brand new, not only with a new coach with Sprinkle, but also to the Big Ten, which is a totally new experience. We're going to be doing a lot of traveling. And you have them ranked 17th, of course, with all the caveats that we don't know what these teams' players are going to look like. We don't know how the team's going to gel. We don't know who's going to be healthy. We don't know how travel is going to affect these West Coast teams in basketball, which I think is going to be, we both suspect is going to be a little bit more taxing than it is for the football teams. So anyway, we got a lot of stuff going on this year. And I think, Sprinkle, you always have a couple years or grace period, but he's got some pieces. So it's, you have him 17th, but I think it would not be unreasonable to imagine them much better than that, but you just don't know.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, again, I'm putting them here because there's uncertainty and it's the first year of a new program. And as you say, everything's new. New coach, mostly new roster, new league. I mean, that's as new as it gets. But is there the potential for them to be better than this? Sure. There could even be the potential for this to be a tournament team for all I know. It's pure guesswork, but I feel as if there are other teams that either are bringing back more, so I think are ahead of the game in terms of continuity, or I just like their portal classes a little better. Or their newcomers, including freshmen, a little better. That's why. But it doesn't mean that they're, again, as I mentioned with Minnesota, it's even more true with this team, I would say. This is, by historic standards, when you think about what historically is to be a team very near the bottom of the Big Ten from a quality perspective, that this team is better than what you think of with that. It's just that there's 18 teams and you got to pick somebody to finish 17th. There's some interesting pieces here. Osobor is a legit cornerstone player. Any high major program in the country would have wanted him, and some pursued him. I think Kentucky, if I remember correctly, was very much in that mix, for example. And he's got help. The nice thing for them, physically, in year one of the Big Ten, they're not going to have a problem. We kept named injury-shortened season, but very productive for them last year when he was healthy. Osobor then joining him at the 4, and then you throw in guys like Breedenbach, Abekwe, and Conway. That's a lot of depth in terms of big people. And it's not just bodies. Like, there's some guys in there that can really play. So that could be a really good 1-2 punch inside, and again, good depth behind them. I think the questions with this team are primarily on the perimeter. So Diallo's we talked about. McDonald's All-American, high-level recruit, guy everybody wanted. So there's zero doubt about his potential, but we see it all the time. Some freshmen that are at that level hit the ground running. They're immediately able to impact games. Others take some time. You don't know where Diallo's going to fall on that continuum. I would say the track record on young guards who struggle to shoot well from range, the track record for early production is not generally fantastic. And that would be the book on him as of this point. We'll see if he improves that over the off season. But they're going to play him a lot because, one, Sprinkle fought hard to keep him in the fold. He had committed to Washington under Hopkins. And then when Hopkins got fired, he reopened his recruitment. But Sprinkle really worked to keep him on board. What that probably equates to is, well, he's got to be, you're in one of these situations as a coach where, all right, I managed to keep or successfully recruit an elite recruit. Now what do? Well, you got to play him. Regardless, you got to play him.
Right.
Because if you don't, and he's a local kid too, so there's that element. You want to establish yourself with local high school and AAU coaches and the power brokers in that area. If you recruit the kid and you don't play him, or you don't play him enough, does that hurt your efforts with other guys going for? These are all the things a coach has to juggle. So I do think, though, he'll probably provide, at the very least, some dynamism offensively with his ability to get inside the arc, get to the rim, get into the lane, and create some havoc there. The veterans, the thing that worries me is there's not an indication that this is likely to be a great three-point shooting team. And while I get and understand that not everybody needs to be Alabama, and I actually support that. I don't love that style of basketball. Aesthetically, I don't. But you do have to be able to stretch the floor some. It makes it difficult offensively if you just can't get any production from outside. Last season, Washington actually had some of that. We mentioned Brooks was a 38% shooter from three. Corin Johnson, 37%. Moses Wood, 40%. They had some guys who could shoot. The players who were coming in, by and large, at those perimeter spots, there's not a ton of great proven shooting. I mean, DJ Davis could be a guy. If Tyler Harris converts, transferring up from Portland, maybe he helps too. But that would be the concern I have, is that there's not enough perimeter shooting, and it's going to mean that even though they've got talent and size on the interior, that those guys struggle more than they should because of spacing issues. So we'll see. I think that there's talent here. How it all fits together remains to be seen. There's potential for them to be better than I've picked them, but this is where I'm starting from.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing is you saying you're guaranteed they're going to be in 17th place.
Yeah, guaranteed. Lock. Mortal lock.
Finally, just a quick word of thanks to all of you who support the show. We really appreciate those who support via one-time gifts and a recurring basis is what keeps us on the air. We really appreciate that. Special thanks to Patreon supporters at the Mateen Cleaves level: Bill Church, Brian O'Donnell, Michael Bosnick, Chad Hickey. Also Draymond Green supporters: Adam Walzak, Dan Rankin, James Benton, Jim L., David Brame, Paul Marsh, Scott Driscoll, and Daniel Dronach, and all the Scott Scowl supporters on Patreon, as well as those on Substack: Rich Weigenheim and Ken Kramat. Thank you so much. If we appreciate you, and if you appreciate what we're doing and want to help support us, a couple bucks a month or something like that, head on over to thefinalfoursontheschedule.com/support. You can find all the necessary links to help support the show, so it keeps us going. So until next time, in Team 16, the Final Four is on the schedule. Go Green.